Hello there, Romans here and welcome to my new music review. Today it's going to be something different. I'm gonna talk about Bon Jovi and the first 6 albums that the Bon Jovi released. Now, the point of this kind of new series within music reviews is that there are many bands that released more than 10 albums, and if you have never listened to any of those records, it may be kind of overwhelming and you may kind of wonder where to start, what to do, which record to pick as the first one. And even though that there are many lists, many recommendations on the internet and everywhere, I think that sometimes very good albums tend to be overlooked by either more appreciated or more commercially successful records, and sometimes slightly less good albums are recommended. So this is just strictly my own subjective opinion. I will do more bands like this. This was actually the original idea why I wanted to start YouTube, to kind of help people to navigate through long discographies of the bands. So today it's going to be Bon Jovi, and I'm gonna look at their first 6 albums, so the period from 1984 until 1995.
Music review. Music review.
I'm not gonna go in history into too much depth, as that's something that you can Google out or find out on the internet. It's not really that important. I'm gonna review the records as they were. The first album Bon Jovi released was a self-titled debut album back in 1984. Now, this is an album that had some external songwriters, not necessarily because they were called to write those songs, but because John Bon Jovi, shortly before he formed this lineup that recorded the first album, he tried his luck with quite a lot of different musicians, and eventually he found the right people whom with he recorded the first album. Now, the first Bon Jovi album is probably kind of different. If you know their songs, if you know their hits, there is a chance you will know Runaway. What I like about this record is that it has a very strong 80s atmosphere. So we've got very strong and dominant keyboards with a lot of hard and heavy guitars. Now, hard and heavy is a style that was kind of made successful by Dokken, and you had some other bands like Icon or Cobra. Even Kiss with Winnie Vincent played 2 records that were kind of going in that hard and heavy direction, you know, like harder than hard rock, less heavy than heavy metal, so something in between. And this record has a pretty dark atmosphere, what I really like about it. You've got 2 songs that go in the style of a pop rock music, like Runaway, which is probably the song you may know. This is a pretty known song that made it to many of their set lists on numerous tours that they had. Then it's She Don't Know Me, which is also a sort of a commercial radio friendly ballad, but I really like some darker songs. One of the absolute gems of the album is Shot Through the Heart, which is just fantastic. Same goes to Roulette, or the ballad Love Lies, which has some typical 80s moments, but it's also much darker than the rest of the album. And the other songs pretty much show what Bon Jovi would become in the next couple of years and on their next albums, as it's sort of a like traditional party rock, arena rock album. Songs like Come Back, which is actually also kind of going in that hard and heavy direction, then Get Ready, Burning for Love, and so on. So I think that this album is really great. So I would personally give it 8 points out of 10. A year later, Bon Jovi released a second album called 7800 degrees Fahrenheit, which is actually the temperature at which rock melts. And the second album is one of a very few Bon Jovi records where all the songs were written by the members of the band. And I just think that this album is such a fantastic album. This album is a masterpiece. I think it's a very overlooked gem in Bon Jovi's discography. And what I really love is the overall atmosphere of the album. It kind of feels like a soundtrack for an 80s action thriller, everything that happens in the movies at night. Think Beverly Hills Cop, but without daylight. I really like that those hard and heavy guitars are up front, and the whole record just sounds more metal. It's like really the style glam rock, glam metal that was becoming successful because of the bands like Mötley Crüe, and Bon Jovi were one of the bands playing this genre. So songs that kind of go in that hard and heavy direction are In and Out of Love, Price of Love, even a single Only Lonely, which may sound a little bit like She Don't Know Me in terms of being radio friendly. It's also so much darker. Then you've got songs like King of the Mountain, Secret Dreams, Always Run to You, or especially To the Fire, which just have such a strong soundtrack-like quality. Then you've got a ballad on this album called Silent Night, and this is probably the first typical Bon Jovi ballad. Then you've got some typical Bon Jovi party rock songs like Tokyo Road or Hardest Part Is the Night. John Bon Jovi is a very recognizable singer. You can immediately say it's him when you hear him, which also makes him very easy to imitate. Now, the first two albums include his vocal performance in a very raw form. His vocals are very raw and unpolished, and that's what I really like about it. And sometimes he also hits very high notes, which is something that stopped being typical for him throughout the 80s up until now. At this time, Bon Jovi were still an underground band. They were not very famous, but I think that even if they didn't become famous with the next album, I think these two albums would become cult records because I really love them. They are very strong. I would give the second album 9 points out of 10. This is a record you have to listen to. Funny thing is that Bon Jovi never really liked that album. They were not very satisfied with the production, with the overall sound, which is probably the reason why the tracks never really made it to their live settings apart from the tour they had supporting this album. One more thing I really love about these two albums is that there are so many moments where you say, oh, these are typical 80s, but I think these records are partially responsible for us having those connotations with the 80s, like you hear a certain sound on keyboards or you hear certain guitar part and you say that sounds like from the 80s. Well, Bon Jovi was one of the bands that made us have those connotations with the 80s. In 1986, Bon Jovi released their third album called Slippery When Wet, which is one of the best-selling albums of all times, and this is the album that transformed Bon Jovi from relatively unknown band into a commercial superstars and one of the most successful bands of all times. Now, Slippery When Wet is a different record. It was released in 1986 and it's slightly different from the previous two because it's slightly more polished and it's more leaning towards that glam rock and hard rock rather than some traces of metal that were there present before. This was also the record where they teamed up with one of the best songwriters of all times, Desmond Child, who was responsible for co-writing song I Was Made for Loving You from Kiss, or Poison from Alice Cooper, or Crazy from Aerosmith, and of course he was responsible for numerous hits from Bon Jovi, and he co-wrote two of their most famous songs, You Give Love Bad Name and Living on a Prayer, from this album. And even this album, when it opens up with the song Let It Rock, this is just such a anthemic rock song, and I think that it just shows that this is one hell of a party rock album, even with the song like, for example, Raise Your Hands, which they even occasionally play like now. There is also a typical Bon Jovi ballad, Never Say Goodbye. I like that they experimented a little bit with the sound and they included some country influences in the song Wanted Dead or Alive, another very, very well known song. And then you've got some songs which go more in the direction of a pop rock or AOR kind of style, songs like I'd Die For You or Without Love, and I think that this record also is responsible for those 80s connotations that you might have. I personally cannot really listen to You Give Love Bad Name and Living on a Prayer anymore because I've heard the songs way too many times, but this is a fantastic album and I really love the last song, Wild in the Streets, which just has that Bruce Springsteen kind of vibe. I would probably give it 9 points out of 10. I think it's kind of logical why it became so popular. Now, in 1988, Bon Jovi released their fourth album called New Jersey, and this was a record that was recorded by superstars. That's the difference from previous albums, because even Slippery When Wet was recorded, they recorded it when they were still not very famous, but New Jersey, they were already superstars, so there was kind of pressure, probably. Some people criticize the album for being kind of overproduced. I personally don't have a problem with that. I think it's fantastic. They teamed up with more external songwriters. So they also had Holy Night, a songwriter that you will find on a couple of records from bands in the 80s and 90s, and also Diana Warren, who's also, similar to Desmond Child, one of the most famous songwriters of all time. She's probably the most famous for writing I Don't Wanna Miss a Thing from Aerosmith. They included acoustic guitar more. On the previous albums it was just like occasionally, but this album has some country vibes. Also keyboards kind of feel like they are less dominant as they were before. And I also like that Richie Sambora, who was guitar player in Bon Jovi, was fantastic singer, and what I always loved about Bon Jovi were those huge, enormous vocals. And I think that New Jersey is one of those albums that show just Richie Sambora's backing vocals, and they usually sing a lot of harmonies to John's voice, and it's just amazing. You know, he's such a fantastic singer. I would say I don't even think that John Bon Jovi is actually a better singer than Richie Sambora, just my opinion. Again, the album opens up with just such a strong party rock song, Lay Your Hands on Me, which has slightly similar development of the beginning as the first track from the previous album, Let It Rock. And then you've got some other songs continuing this trend like Bad Medicine or 99 in Shade. Then you've got some songs that lean more towards pop rock kind of style, like Born to Be My Baby, Stick to Your Guns, and two of the songs that have those country vibes like Blood on Blood, also slightly Bruce Springsteen-ish kind of song, and Wild is the Wind, which is just such a fantastic song. And then you've got a ballad, probably the most famous song for people today is I'll Be There For You, but I personally prefer the ballad Living in Sin, which is just such jam, really. I also forgot to mention that this album has one of the heaviest tracks Bon Jovi ever wrote, which is called Homebound Train. And I also love the last track on the album, Love for Sale, which is sort of like country / bluesy song just on acoustic guitars, and it's just such a great ending of the album. What I love about especially these two albums, New Jersey and Slippery When Wet, that there is so much positive energy on those albums. I personally listen to New Jersey in winter, so usually when it's winter time, when there's snow, it's usually when I want to listen to this record, and it's just one of my all-time favorite rock records. That's why I decided to give this 10 points out of 10. Then Bon Jovi took 4 years off because there was just too much pressure in terms of touring and playing and everything, and they just needed some time off, in which Richie Sambora and even John Bon Jovi, they released their solo albums, and in 1992 they got back together with the album Keep the Faith. Keep the Faith was an album that was recorded and released at the time when hard rock, glam rock, hair metal were still a thing, but this genre was reaching its end in 1992 with the arrival of grunge and Nirvana. A lot of people say that grunge killed rock music, which is partially true. Grunge showed another evolutionary step of rock music, but it's probably for a different video. What I love about Keep the Faith is that Bon Jovi evolved. They had completely new sound, new style, and the album still sounds like them. And it's just amazing that they were able to create so many different albums. It's leading more towards the style of pop rock and rock and roll. Again, they teamed up with Desmond Child, who was responsible for co-writing many of the songs. You've got a couple of more upbeat songs like I Believe, also Keep the Faith, which has a slightly funky vibe. It's just such a trademark, such a 90s trademark song. Then Woman in Love or Fear. Then they have some more pop rock songs, like for example In These Arms, a monster ballad, Bed of Roses, which I think everybody knows, and I Want You, another fantastic ballad. I like that they also experimented on the album. They have, for example, song If I Was Your Mother, which is very heavy song. The riff is something that I would expect Zakk Wylde and Ozzy Osbourne writing together or coming up with. And then you've got Dry Country, which is a song that I wouldn't necessarily call as a progressive song, but it's almost 10 minutes song that has different parts. There's a very long solo by Richie Sambora where he really proved to be a great guitar player, and I just really like how artistic the whole album sounds. There are also some songs going more in the style of rock and roll, like I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, Blame It on the Love of Rock and Roll, or Little Bit of Soul. And one of the songs that is slightly more experimental in terms of sound is Save a Prayer. So I think this is a fantastic album. I would give it 9 points out of 10. After this, Bon Jovi released a greatest hits compilation called Crossroads in 1994, and there were two new songs on the album, one of which became one of the most famous songs Bon Jovi ever released, and it's a song called Always. The last album I'm gonna talk about today is album These Days from 1995. Now, These Days is, for me personally, the last really great album Bon Jovi released. It's yet another completely different album from everything they released before. Yet again, it's so artistic. I love their development and it's just fantastic. I think that this is a very overlooked album because from a viewpoint of today's casual music listener, there isn't one song you would know. You wouldn't know any songs because they are not played on radios anymore. From what I've heard, you know, I don't really listen to radios. These Days is a record that came out at the time when rock music was officially dead. Grunge was also out of the game, and when grunge hit the scene, there were two things that bands could do. They could either adapt and create a music that was more reminiscent of grunge, or that was grunge, or they could stop existing. Some of the bands had an opportunity to kind of continue, but with their music being less heavy and more radio friendly. So this is what happened with this record. Same thing happened with Aerosmith and their Nine Lives album, which is also more of a pop rock album. And These Days is also a very pop rock record. It's much softer than the previous albums, but I just love how dark and artistic the whole record is. This is an album I've been listening to in summer 2006, so New Jersey is an album that reminds me of winter. This is the album that reminds me of summer. You can hear some grunge influences on the record in a song like Hey God, or even My Guitar Lies Bleeding in My Arms, which is a very epic song. There is one riff that is kind of like grungy a little bit, and there is also a song All I Want Is Everything, which is slightly more leaning towards alternative rock. This is one of the songs I don't really know that well because the version I had didn't include this song. Then you've got some upbeat pop rock songs like Something for the Pain, If That's What It Takes, Hearts Breaking Even, or the song Damned, which kind of reminds me of I'll Sleep When I'm Dead. And then there are quite many slower songs and ballads like These Days and Lie to Me, It's Hard Letting Go, such a beautiful ballad, and one of probably my most favorite Bon Jovi song, Something to Believe In. Then you've got Diamond Ring, which is like okay, and Bitter Wine, which has a very 2000-ish kind of vibe. So I think that this is just such a great and artistic record. For me, 10 points out of 10. So when it comes to my recommendations, I would pretty much say if you like rock music and if you like good music in general, I would encourage you to check all of these 6 albums. They are fantastic, and I will always respect Bon Jovi for how fantastic they made those records. This is it for me. I hope you liked this review. If you did, you can leave a comment in the comment section below. You can let me know which records do you prefer. If you agree or disagree with me, you can follow me on Instagram or on Facebook. You can find the links in the description below. And you can let me know in the comment section if you want me to do a second part that will deal with the rest of their discography. Honestly, I think I will be slightly less positive with the rest of their discography, but you know, I know those records, so I can give you my opinion, and there will be more bands that I will review as their whole discographies. So, thanks for watching and see you at the next music review. Music review.
What's wrong with you?
Absolutely fantastic. Keep the Faith, which has almost... So that was like a zlatko. Almost Keep the Faith, probably the most famous song of... No. So almost Keep the Faith.